Good morning again. And I want to start off this class with kind of mythbusters. There's always a bunch of myths on terrorism that are out there that pretty much need to be debunked. So if you guys are studying and are going to be part of the terrorism, counterterrorism community, you need to understand these myths and what the real ground truth is. So terrorism, for the most part, is the most politically skewed issue out there. They said that there's probably more counterterrorism analysts than actual terrorists out there. And if you, in the wake of the Boston bombing, you probably saw a bunch of talking heads on Fox News, MSNBC, making all sorts of assertions. And usually, the most point, they don't know what they're talking about. And for the most part, the politicians, well, not for the most part, a lot of time, the politicians don't know what they're talking about. So these are kind of six myths that have permeated the terrorist literature that have kind of are out there. So the first is that myth one is that terrorists are crazy. And I have a little bit of a caricature guy here. And, it's kind of funny. I pulled off the internet, but you hear that all the time. These guys are crazy. The brothers in Chechnya in Boston, they must have been crazy or psychologically wrong, or something psychologically must be wrong with them. Um, that's not true. In fact, terrorists are usually very rational. They can't be totally crazy to set up some of the to plan and to execute some of the large scale attacks. But most importantly, they're not crazy because terrorism oftentimes achieves the objective that they're seeking. They do spread fear among the population. That might sound crazy to you, but if that's their objective and that's what they want to do, then it's not really crazy. In fact, it's very rational. So that's myth number one. Myth number two is that terrorism doesn't work, and you'll hear that. You hear that after Boston. The terrorists will never affect us, or terrorism will never get what they want. Terrorism never works. You've probably heard that. In reality, terrorism does work. It works sometimes very well. This I don't know if you guys have remember this. Some of you might be alive who actually were around when this happened. This is the 1972 Munich massacre, where Israeli athletes were taken hostage, and they were killed in the terrorist attack. But what it did is it brought all sorts of publicity to the Palestinian cause that was not available beforehand. And in fact, Yasser Arafat, a year later, was able to speak in front of the United Nations, largely because of the attention brought by what happened in Munich. So that's an example where terrorism worked. Again, another example, the 2004 Madrid bombings. It worked. It got the government to change their policy in Iraq, got the Spanish government to do that. In Boston, you can say that if their goal was to spread fear, they did it. Those two brothers, they spread a certain amount of fear. They shut down the city for a day. They brought all sorts of attention to Chechnya in the media that wasn't readily there a month ago or even a week ago. So it does work. It achieves its objective. So myth three, you'll hear this on the left. Terrorism is caused by poverty. Here you see Palestinians shifting through garbage to find something to eat. I'm not going to say that terrorism has nothing to do with poverty, but poverty usually isn't the overriding cause. The examples, the 9/11 hijackers were not poverty-stricken, at least their leadership, and certainly Osama bin Laden was not. The Fort Hood shooter, he was not in poverty. Nations that sponsor terrorism, or nations that are part of terrorism, like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, where many religious fundamentals come from, they're not poverty-stricken. In fact, if poverty was the cause of terrorism, you'd see a lot more terrorism coming out of Bangladesh or sub-Saharan Africa. So no, poverty is not the main driver of terrorism. Sometimes it has a factor, but rarely is it the main driver. So that brings us to myth four. Terrorists hate our freedom, and that was said by, this is a picture of George Bush after the 9/11 attacks, and he said that pretty specifically, that terrorists hate democracy, they hate our freedoms, they hate, that we can practice free speech. It's not really true. Terrorists don't hate what we do in our country. They usually hate our policies. Osama bin Laden never hated our democracy. He hated our support for Israel and our stationing of troops in Saudi Arabia. Terrorists usually don't hate our freedoms. They're very ambivalent to it. They're more focused on U.S., particularly anti-U.S. terrorists, or they're focused against U.S. policies. Whether they're right or wrong, that's their focus. Myth 5, most people probably in this class will understand that terrorism is not confined to the Islamic world. Kind of have a picture here. This is IRA bombing in the 1980s. Yes, we're seeing a lot of terrorism coming out of the Islamic world now, but in previous generations it was against Western. It was, again, you see Irish, you see terrorism in Africa, you saw anti-colonial terrorism all throughout Africa and Asia. It was not necessarily confined to the Islamic world. In fact, the biggest perpetrators of suicide bombers are not Palestinians or Arabs. They're in Sri Lanka, the Tamil Tigers. So you hear that terrorism comes from the Middle East a lot on the news, but in reality, terrorism is a much more widespread phenomenon. And the final myth, myth 6, the victims are the targets. Rarely is the victim of terrorism the target. It is usually the people that die are tragic, but usually the people that are focused on is a third party. We're going to talk about next week the target of terrorism by the Irgun was not the Arabs. It was the media. It was the media in New York and in London. That was their target. The target for the 9/11 hijackers wasn't the people specifically in the World Trade Center, but the target was the audience, the greater Muslim world, to advance a narrative that the Muslim world is under persecution. That's who you're looking for. You're trying to appeal to a broader audience, not just the people that you kill, but the people outside the locus of conflict. So those are the myths of terrorism, and I hope you took something away from this lecture.